fine. Whose interests are opposed to that of the public? Oh, you're saying is this your question about the manuscripts, Happy 65? Okay. Whose interests are opposed to that of the public? I only found that Marx states that competition is the cause and reason of this universal poisoning. Not sure if that's it, though. Thank you. So you're saying whose interests are opposed to the public in Marxist theory or in the economic manuscripts? Stream seems good to me. Awesome. Looking forward to that journal, Eddie. Thank you. Thank you. Our other journal's right up there. I don't know if you can see it. Actually, I'm going to grab it quick and then I'll answer your question, Happy 65. But do you mean whose interests are opposed to the public that Marx is talking about in the manuscripts? Let's get them up here. Pull up them boys, the manuscripts, and take a look at them. One sec. Shoot. I also want my cool lights to be glowing. I paid for them. I got to use them. No, that's not my complete question. Okay. Give me your complete question. And don't feel stupid. Don't feel like that was a stupid question, right? Like there are no stupid questions, especially when you're starting out with Marxism, because it's complicated. And even Marx and Engels and Lenin's attempts to simplify Marxism, they're good and they're helpful, but it's still more complicated than that, right? You can only learn the theory thoroughly by putting a lot of time and energy into studying it. Not everybody's had time to do that or energy to do that yet. So it's difficult. And then on top of that, there's all the bourgeois lies. There's all these lies and misconceptions that have been piled on, Marx and Engels to try and get people to think they're crazy. And, they didn't say anything that was true and none of their predictions came true. And it just leads to a dictatorship every time. If you read the Communist Manifesto once, your whole family goes to the gulag. What do you make of Marx's criticism of business secrecy, adulteration of products, profiting from poverty, monopoly pricing, and those whose interests are opposed to that of the public? This comes from the Marxist Study Guide. I posted the complete question. I'm not sure if you can see it. I can see it for sure. Sorry, I was just finishing my ramble. Criticism of adulteration of the product, profiteering from poverty, monopoly pricing, and people whose interests are opposed to the public. I mean, it's absolutely true. Sorry, a police officer just drove by my house. That was scary. It just always makes me like, ugh, the cops, a cab. But yeah, I mean, the interests of the bourgeoisie are opposed to the public because of competition, like you said, and mainly competition. It mainly stems from competition, right? Because corporations need to constantly expand. They need to constantly make a profit. They need to accumulate capital. These things are all true, but the reason that they have to constantly expand is because if they don't, they'll go out of business. Right? If they're not constantly expanding, constantly increasing the amount of profit they're making, then they're going to be outcompeted by their competitors in the market, people who are investing in innovation and expanding their productive output and marketing and lobbying the government in all these things. So you have businesses who act in secrecy. Like a good example of that would be intellectual property laws. Businesses act in secrecy and they keep their information about the market and about consumer demand and about what people need and new technologies that they develop, innovative products that they develop. Even if those products are, say, like medicine, like insulin, that could help tons and tons of people, they're going to keep the patent on that. They're going to use intellectual property laws to keep that patent, maintain secrecy so that they can maximize their own profits. And that's directly antagonistic to what's good for the public. Great example here, since I was just talking about it and reading about it, the opioid epidemic, right? They know now that corporations created webs of influence that included government institutions, academia, etc., in order to lie about opioids so that they could expand the market, so that they could start prescribing opioids for pain and anxiety, which made millions and millions of dollars for the pharmaceutical company. And they knew all along that it would increase addiction and probably lead to deaths, which, now in America we have 60,000, it's either 60,000 opioid related overdoses a year or 60,000 total overdoses a year, and like 80% of them are opioids, especially fentanyl. Either way, just an astronomical number. So there's a way that corporate secrecy and corporate lying was used to make profits in the market, but was directly antagonistic to the interests of the public. Adulteration of products. I can't remember what Marx means by adulteration. I always have to look up definitions of some of the words he uses. Making something poor in quality. Yeah, there's another, like, that's why we had to have the FDA. Why the FDA had to come about, and I don't even know when that was. When was the FDA created? 1906. Because, like, corporations, because, like I said, they're just trying to make as much money as they can, and compete with other firms in the market. Like, if they could make bread with sawdust in it and the consumers aren't going to notice, they're going to put sawdust in the bread because it's a cheaper material than flour or wheat or whatever it actually takes to make bread. So we had to have the FDA to regulate corporations, make sure they're not purposefully adulterating their products, their food products that we consume, making them cheaper and less healthy for you. Even though, that largely hasn't worked. The FDA is largely co-opted by corporations too. Again, all driven by market competition, right? If I am a baker and there's another baker in this area and we share the same market, we have the same pool of consumers that we're trying to sell our bread to, and I start putting 50% sawdust in my bread and nobody notices, even though it's unhealthy for the people, even though it's not in the public interest for me to put sawdust in my bread because it's making people unhealthy, it's ruining public health. It helps me within the market competition, right? It helps me spend less on the productive commodities, the materials needed to make my bread, so then I can sell it and make more profit from the sale. My margins will be higher than the competitors, and eventually I can buy out my competitors or force them out of the market. Profiting from poverty. We'll talk about a little bit of how corporations profit from poverty today, in the modern day, later in the stream. Monopoly pricing. Yeah, if there's no competitors in the market, or if corporations are working together, collaborating to screw people, obviously they can set prices a lot easier, because competition, if I have a competitor over there selling the same thing as me, I can't just raise my price super high, or people will just go buy from my competitor. People whose interests, and yeah, that's why the capitalist interests are directly opposed to the interests of the public. And important point, that's why they can't help it, right? That's why it's not that the capitalists are just bad, evil people who were born hating poors and hating the working class, right? They have to continually expand, have to continually grow their capital, grow the amount of surplus value that they're siphoning from the labor of the workers. Otherwise, they will be pushed out of business by their competitors. So the market system itself, capitalism itself, commodity production itself is directly antagonistic. It's contradictory. It encourages production that's antagonistic with the interests of the public, which is how corporations and conglomerates who have the most control over public health, the health of populations in the US, literally lied so that they could sell more opioids, which destroyed public health. Probably the biggest public health disaster of the last 20 years outside of the COVID pandemic. And they knew it was going to happen the whole time, but they still lied and actively formed webs of influence so that they could expand their markets and bring in more exchange value. And again, the way I like to conceptualize this, as Marx does in the first 3 chapters of Capital: exchange value versus use value. Use value, you can't quantify it, you can't put a number on it. It's how much use that a product gives to or brings to the person who buys it or to populations of people. And you can't sell a product even under capitalism unless it has some kind of use value. Otherwise, nobody will buy it. But then the exchange value is how much a commodity is worth in comparison to the other commodities in circulation, which is measured as price, right? And capitalists are after exchange value, right? They're trying to produce a product for as cheaply as possible, which, like we said, can cause them to do things like put sawdust in their bread. Produce it as cheaply as possible and sell it for as high of a price as possible, which is, why we have so much money go into marketing, to try and artificially inflate that price and artificially inflate consumer demand for the product. So then, rather than focusing on use value, how much use products and commodities can bring, or not commodities, but products can bring to populations, can bring to the people, corporations engaging in market activity and subject to market competition are only focused on exchange value. On, like we said, creating cheap products that they can sell for a high price, make surplus value, use that surplus value to expand their empire. And yeah, when you look at the opioid epidemic, and this is part of the reason I'm doing the Journal of American Socialist Studies too, on the healthcare industry, also because I've been studying healthcare, and also because 20% of America's GDP is healthcare spending. So it makes up a huge part of our economy, and the conglomerates who dominate the healthcare industry are some of the most powerful conglomerates in our overall economy. But also because the things like the opioid epidemic provide such a great example of how corporations put exchange value above use value, right? The use value of opioids, not to say they're useless, or they should be completely done away with, or they can't be used, to help people with certain conditions. But they knew that the use value of opioids would get people addicted and lead to death, right? It leads people to continue buying opioids. They eventually run out of money. They can't afford the opioids, or they can't get a prescription anymore because the doctors blacklist them once they develop an addiction and a dependency. And then they switch to what's cheaper, which is heroin. So the use value of opioids literally gets people addicted to heroin or fentanyl and kills them. But they still sold them. They still expanded the market for them while knowing this, because exchange value comes first for them. Surplus value comes first for them. So that's how the capitalists' interests are directly opposed to the interests of the public. That's what Marx is talking about for the most part, and that's how the capitalist market system, the most highly developed form of commodity production, is antagonistic to the interests of the working class. And that's why we have to overthrow the capitalists and move to a new system. That was a long ramble. Sorry if that was too much, Happy 65, but you asked me about something interesting. So, Ewoks Unhinged. Thank you. My question is, again, like last time, from Marx's Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844. How does Marx connect the fate of feudalism with the fate of landed property? How does Marx connect the fate of feudalism and the fate of landed property? I mean, in a general sense, because every Marxist should study the French Revolution and the revolutions that brought an end to feudalism and the reign of the Catholic Church and that aristocracy in Europe. Because basically you had first the production of commodities and the circulation of commodities had evolved to a really high level because of the advance of technology. So the advance of technology was starting to bring about the industrial revolution, which allowed for more powerful ships and methods of transportation to bring commodities around, to circulate commodities faster, as well as an increase in machines and machine production and how efficient machine production actually was. Um, so with that, there's a great increase in commodities, and you start to see the formation of these manufacturing factories. And workers paid wages in those factories. And it evolves from basically these guilds, where you had like journeymen who would train under a master in whatever craft, and they would produce commodities locally. But as this evolves, as they produce more and more, and as the methods of transportation evolve more and more, the production is expanded, and it starts to look more and more like capitalist factory production that we see today, like the assembly line. So as this happens, the factory owners, the former guild masters, or just the people who own that facility and own the machines that are producing all these things, start to become the most powerful economic class in society. They start to become more powerful than the lords who own these giant swaths of land and have peasants farming under them, as well as the merchants, the people involved in the transportation of these commodities, also start to become one of the most powerful economic classes in society, because they're also making money off the sale and transport of commodities that other people create with their labor. So as this bourgeois class, and that's what we call them, the bourgeoisie, they started as merchants and guild owners or factory owners. They start to organize themselves. You also have the Enlightenment, where this philosophy of reason comes about, and we can decide what our society is like and what our government is like based on reason, and using logic, rather than previously under feudalism. The church said that these kings, these lords, these landowners are ordained by God, and if you're a peasant, you just have to work under them really hard because that's what God wants. So that goes away largely with the Enlightenment. And you have these revolutions like the French Revolution, which are the peasants fighting against the landowners, the lords, yes, but it's also the bourgeoisie. It's the capitalists leading these revolutions and fighting alongside the peasants, or leading the peasants in this class struggle against the feudal aristocracy, the church and the landlords. So that leads to a change in property, right? The land that's owned by the feudal lords is transferred to the bourgeoisie, and you see more and more industrialization, and more peasants are forced off of their land and into the towns to work in manufacturing jobs rather than agricultural jobs, or rather than working under the lord who's no longer in power. Um, and it's a transfer of property. So class struggle and ideological struggle with the Enlightenment leads to a transfer of property, a change in property ownership, a change in who owns the means of production and the land, from the aristocracy, the feudal aristocracy, to the bourgeoisie. So that creates capitalism, though. That creates a system of wage labor where everybody works under this bourgeois class. So the class struggle then under capitalism becomes the proletarians, the working people, versus the capitalists who now own the land rather than the aristocracy. So the struggle of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie comes to an end, or is final, or leads to the transfer of property, the transfer of the means of production and the land, from the hands of the bourgeoisie into the hands of the workers. Um, so yeah, that's the best answer I can give you. Hopefully that answered your question, but hit me with any follow-ups. Coup in Peru, Eddie. Was there a coup? I know that Castillo has not been popular. Pedro Castillo has not been popular, nor anti-imperialist, nor socialistic. Fact, the merchant class on steroids. Basically, um, and Marx makes this prediction in the manifesto, where he says that capitalism for the first time divides society into two great classes, right? So under feudalism, you had a handful of classes, but under capitalism, there's two great ones. There's the capitalists and the workers, which, capitalism has other classes besides the workers and the owners. Like, that was probably Marx just simplifying things in the manifesto, because he goes on to talk about like productive versus unproductive labor and the transport industry, and the differences between these different classes within capitalism. um, Still, ultimately, you have the wage laborers, the people who sell their labor for a wage, and then you have the owners. But there's like small business owners, right? There's the petty bourgeoisie. There's the lumpen proletariat, which Marx says are people who don't actually sell their labor. They make money through crime and other methods like that. Um, there's Marx never saw this come about really, but the professional managerial class, a class of people who are basically the managers and the professionals, that have come about with capitalist development. So it's a question of who are the allies of the proletariat. There's a really good piece, or there's a really good part of CPUSA's manual of 1935 that talks about who the allies of the proletariat are, and they talk about the petty bourgeoisie, the lumpen elements, things like this. So, yeah, that's a bit of a tangent, but hopefully that answers your question basically. Great answer, Eddie. Cleared up some misunderstandings I was having. Great. I'm glad to hear that. This is the last thing I'll say about it before we move on, but one sec. Like, something to understand is, like, when I was first reading Marx, I always wanted them to explain that more in depth. I always wanted them to explain the transition out of feudalism and into capitalism more in depth. And you realize that they do. They do explain it and they do analyze it extremely thoroughly, but they're also like living in this time where capitalism has just come to prominence, right? And they're living in Europe where everybody has just witnessed this, right? Everybody's seen it with their own eyes, the transition into capitalism with the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the bourgeois class. So there's less there's less dumbed down basic explanations that they give, right? They never just say, like, directly, here's the connection between feudal property and capitalist property, and how it was abolished under feudalism, and here's how property ownership will change under capitalism. Like, they do say that, but they say it slowly and complexly with a lot of detailed analysis of what's going on. And a lot of what's going on, like now, the Industrial Revolution was however many years ago, hundreds of years ago, but in the late 1800s, it had just kind of come to its completion or fruition. So there's things that they don't explain just because I feel like they expect everybody to know it, because of the time that they were writing in, which is impossible to avoid, really, unless you're like so arrogant that you're like, my writings will be read in the future by millions of people and they'll know I was right. Marx was confident in what he wrote, but he was still writing for people in modern day too. In his modern day. Sorry.